Hi everyone! In this video I will show you how to work with processes, process attributes, process instances, and process versions. Let's talk about processes. A process is a visual model of a business process and is the most important part of an application's functionality. In order to create a new process, select Process from the menu. Specify its name. I'll name it Process Interface. Then specify its location and click Save. Now the new process will appear in the list on the left and its editor will be opened on the right. Let's take a look at the panel on the right. It's a tab bar that allows you to configure the process and monitor its performance. The first tab is the process editor. Here, the process diagram is built using blocks from the shape repository. First of all, a process always starts with the start event block. Then we can use different blocks. For example, it can be a script test block, which allows you to calculate expressions, or a form block that represents a form that is displayed by the user in the interface. It can also be import task, export task, mail task, collapse subprocess, end event, and so on. After we have added blocks to the diagram, we need to link them by using transition arrows. More than one transition arrow can come out of one block. And for each transition, we can set a condition based on which transition should be followed. Now we have created a diagram. We have one script task, two form blocks, a returning transition arrow from the second form to the first form, and an end event block. After this diagram is built, we will save it. If there are any errors in the process structure, the Process Structure Error tab on the right will be highlighted in red. If you open it, you will see error messages. You can double-click on any message to read it in full. After the errors are identified, they need to be fixed. In this case, there are errors because we added two form blocks but didn't bind them to any forms in the application. To fix that, double-click on the form block. This will open the form block editor. Here it is necessary to specify the performer role all, and then select the application form that should be bound to this block. You can select an existing form or create a new one. Now we will set up the second block in the same way. Select the performer role all and create form 2. After that, the process diagram will be saved without errors. Now let's talk about process attributes. This is the third tab. The process context is a set of its attributes. By default, each process has an attribute result. It's a string, and it is used to configure transitions between blocks. We will return to this attribute when we talk about forms in more detail. So we should not delete it as it performs a very important function. In addition to this attribute, you can create your own attributes if needed. When we click the Add Attribute button, a window for creating a new attribute appears. Here we need to enter its name. I will call the attribute Client Process. The word process simply indicates that it's a process attribute. Then we can choose its data type, one of the simple types, a reference to another type or classifier, or a UDML expression. After configuring the attribute, click Save. The new attribute appears on the list. Also pay attention that this tab has a column physical name. When a process is created, Tables of process attributes and thread attributes must be created in the database. In order for these physical tables to be created, it is necessary to restart the application. During the restart, the application will stop. Its model will be synchronized with the database, and after that the application will be launched again. Now we can make sure that all attributes' physical names are set, which means that database tables have been created and we can continue working. Here we see that the physical names are set. Now let's go to the second tab, Data, that displays the process attributes table. We are working with one process diagram, but several process instances can be started based on this diagram. For example, we have several users who work in the application, and each user needs a different interface process. For example, there is a user Jack and a user George. For each of these users, their own process instance will be started, and the monitoring tab will display two active process instances. But how are processes started? Let's go to the Execution Policy tab and look at the launch options. The first option is Auto Run. With this option, this process is started at application startup. The second option is Run for Authentication Verification. This option allows for setting up the process so that when a user enters the application, in addition to entering his login and password, he receives a code via SMS for additional authentication. The third option, which we are interested in, is Run when creating user session. Leave this option enabled and click Save. When this option is enabled, such a process is called an interface process. This means that when entering the form runner, a user session will start and validation will take place. If this user already has a process instance running, this instance will be loaded. If there is no instance, like in our case, then a new one will be started. So here we see the name of the application. Form 1 is still empty. So we see a white screen. But in the application designer, we can see a running process instance. If we open the process monitoring tab, we can see a row that represents this instance. By double-clicking on this row, we can view the details of the process instance. On the first tab, we see the process diagram. Here, the green highlighted block is where we are currently staying. Below this block, there is the name of the user to whom the form is assigned. As you can see, this is my user. I launched the process and the forms were assigned to my user. On the Data tab, we can find the current values of process attributes. If we had any errors in the execution of the process, the block would be highlighted in red and the error message would be displayed below. Apart from that, execution errors can be found on the Process Execution Errors tab. If we have a non-interface process, there are other ways of starting it. One of them is a manual launch. For that, click the Run button on the process toolbar and refresh the list of the running instances. As you can see here, the second instance has appeared. Let's open its details. Note that we are on the first form again. This means that we passed the script block automatically. But this time, the form is not assigned to my user. Here is the login of another user. This happened because when assigning the form, the system found the first user with applied role all. In order for the forms to be assigned to the user who launched the process, it's necessary to set up the assignment procedure in the script block. Now we are in the UDMS editor. Later we will talk about it more. First, let's look at the role assignment. For this, we will use the assignToRole function. In the brackets, you must specify input parameters. The first parameter will be the name of the applied role all, and the second parameter will be the user login. To get the user login, we will use the currentUser function, which will return the login of the user who started the process. When this expression is executed, all forms of the process will be assigned to the user who launched this process. Save the changes, then start the process manually again. The third instance has now appeared on the list. Let's open its details. Here we see the first form, but this time it's assigned to the user who launched the process. Now, another way to start a process is by using the runProcess function. In its input parameters, it's necessary to specify the path to the process and initial values of its attributes if necessary. Now let's talk about the UDMS editor in more detail. UDMS can be described as JavaScript mixed with some UDM. All objects contained in an application are UDM objects. For example, process attributes, types attributes, search methods, custom functions, built-in UDML functions, classifiers, processes, and so on. The UDML language describes all platform metadata. So in order to refer to UDM objects in JavaScript, we have to use the UDM operator. For example, if we want to refer to a process attribute, it's necessary to write such a construction. Since we use UDMS, we can use the JavaScript syntax. For example, we can declare a variable. Since UDMS is a combination of JavaScript and UDML, a certain construction is required to be able to access the JavaScript functionality in UDM. This construction goes as follows: JS, then specify the type of the needed variable. For example, an integer, then the name of the variable in brackets. That's how we can call a JavaScript variable in the UDM. Let's consider the case when we have a variable of a complex type. For example, a JavaScript variable client, to which we will record a new object of type clients. To do this, we will use the UDML new search method in type client. Using this search method, we create a new object of the client type and assign it to the client variable. Now we will be able to access the attributes of the object using JavaScript variables. For example, the last name attribute. And we can even assign some specific value to it. If we need to refer to a complex JavaScript variable in the UDM, the construction will look as follows: JS, then specify the type of the variable. This will be the name of the module and the name of the type. Here it will be main, clients. Then specify the name of the variable in brackets. This is how one would work in the UDMS editor. You can read more about it in the documentation. It contains some useful examples. Another thing you should get familiar with is UDML functions. They are functions that allow you to work with UDM objects. These can be some kind of mathematical calculations working with collections, working with text, various system functions, such as run process or assign to role, various date and time conversion functions, and so on. All functions can be found in the documentation. Also, when you select a specific function, a hint about this function appears below, describing what it takes as input and what it returns as output. Let's go back to process instances. Now we have tried different ways to run a process, and we can notice that each instance has its own version. When we go to the Process Versions tab, we see all saved versions and the number of instances running on each version. This may be necessary if some data on how the diagram should look has changed. For example, if we added some blocks or modified transition arrows. All old process instances should follow the old diagram to be completed, but all new processes should follow the new diagram. However, let's consider the opposite case. When we want to modify the diagram and make sure all process instances follow this new diagram. To do this, go to the Process Monitoring tab. Select all instances and click Refresh button on the process toolbar. Here it is necessary to select the checkbox Force Update. This means that we understand what we are doing and all the risks of this action. For example, if we decided to add some additional block at the beginning of this process, but some of its instances are already staying on later blocks, then these changes will not affect these instances. For example, the second instance was launched from the application designer, but forms are still assigned to users the same way as before. So these risks must always be kept in mind. In some cases, for example, if we need to delete some form or some specific block in the process, if an instance of this process was staying on this block, this instance will most likely become invalid, and we will not be able to restore it as it used to be before. It's very important to remember about these changes when updating process versions. In our case, we have updated the versions, and we can see these changes on the Process Versions tab. If you are working on a test application and you need to be constantly changing something for test purposes, you can delete process instances and then start them again rather than updating the process version. So you can simply launch the modified process either manually from the application designer or by selecting the Run when creating user session execution policy if this process is an interface process. Thank you for watching. In this video you learned about processes, process attributes, process instances, and process versions. In the next video we will talk about forms, form widgets, and form attributes.